looks like it's actually working. Okay.
If you weren't here last week, no problem. These are all standalone classes. But if you were here, welcome back. Quick announcement regarding the little QR code. If you haven't registered online, you can use that code to register, and that way we can send you follow-up information on this class if you're interested in that. If you haven't been in this building, the bathrooms are downstairs, so you can just walk out the door that you came in and just go downstairs to find the bathroom. Let me see if there's anything else on the list that I need to tell you. Okay, so if you haven't been here, the goal is with these mornings that we're having together that you will learn something new, but also potentially that you'll get to know some people and we'll have some discussion around the table. And this is our guest speaker, Dr. Ben McFarland, and I think many of you know Ben. He attends Bethany with his wife Lori and 4 sons. I think he is also the reason that a lot of the choir members had to get up earlier today. Because he also sings in the choir, and he's a professor of biochemistry at SBU and author of a book, By It I See Everything Else, Faith Seeking Understanding Through Science. And we're very glad to have you, Ben.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. I guess I'll use the microphone. But I do want to sort of be down. I mean, it feels like a big room, so I'm going to try to be down and walk around things. As we get started, I would like to have us pray together. And so I think that this is big enough for everyone to see. Move a little closer if you need to see more. But let's read this prayer together as we start our class. Gracious and eternal God, you have filled the cosmos with beauties and wonders. Open our eyes to behold your gracious hand in all your works, so that, rejoicing in your whole creation, we may learn to serve you with gladness. for the sake of him through whom all things were made, your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. All right, so that actually sets a theme for everything that we're talking about. We're talking about theology of creation. And I'm not necessarily here to talk to you about exactly the mechanism of creation, but the theology of creation, because I want to talk about what can we tell from looking around. Now, the title of this, I don't know if anybody recognizes that, but this is not exactly C.S. Lewis's epitaph, but it's pretty close. If you go to Westminster Abbey, has anyone been to Westminster Abbey and gone to Poets' Corner there? So you've been to Westminster Abbey, number one. So you've gone there. And Poets' Corner is a little corner. I forget who else is there, but I know C.S. Lewis was there. And this is what they put on his stone. He's not actually buried there, from what I understand, but he's memorialized there. And by the way, when I was there, Pat, they actually sang "If Ye Love Me" by Thomas Tallis, which is a song that we've sung, and I could have gotten up there and sung with them. They probably would have called security. But that's the whole thing. We are connected to this tradition. C.S. Lewis is one of the connections. He says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And I want to unpack what that means. Of all the words that C.S. Lewis wrote, he wrote these, and these are on his stone. So, I want to look around this room, and I want to ask you a question, not about natural theology, but about architectural theology. Okay? Look at this room, and look at this image that I took one night, right over there, that we can see what's going on with this room. This is a house of God. Someone chose the decisions. Actually, the carpet used to be red. Do anybody remember the red carpet? Okay, of course the colonists do, but probably not a lot of other people. It used to be bright red. We changed it to blue. It was a big debate. But the whole thing, these are debates because these things are important. They have some kind of meaning to them, right? So look around this building and think about what is the meaning. This is supposed to be the house of God. Somebody built this in a certain way to reflect some aspect of God. There's theology built into this structure. What can we tell about God by looking at this building and comparing it to other buildings with other purposes? Any ideas? What about the material? Yeah, and the stone is a natural material, right? So it's kind of bringing nature in and building it into a structure that is for the gathering of the people of God and the worship of God, right? So you can tell something about, there's a theology of creation even in the fact that we use natural materials. Now looking around, the natural materials are sort of smoothed out, but there are some evocations of what nature is like. And that God created nature, from comparing this to like a regular old office meeting room. You know, we're not meeting in a conference room, we're meeting in a church. So what makes this room different from like the conference room in Amazon or something like that? Laura?
Just the vaulted ceiling lifts your eyes up.
Right, so going up, and that implies, what does that imply to you?
It just implies we think of God as being in heaven, which is a body to be translated.
Right, in the vast expanse, you know. Before they used to think that it was a big blue dome over us. Now we know it goes to infinity. And yet it doesn't, the physics of it says that it goes to infinity in space, possibly, but not in time. We go only back a certain amount. And that's an interesting thing to think about. So, yeah, we have the vaulted ceiling is one of the big things. And one of the big things, you can think about the sanctuary across the street, also has a very high ceiling. It replaced a bunch of houses, and they built high up to do that. Yeah, what else can you see looking around this structure that tells you about that?
Well, the cross is front and center.
Yeah, there you have that. And it's, is this a true story? Tell me if this is the wrong story, old timers. I'm an old timer too. Okay, so, but isn't the story that originally there was a stained glass window there, and there was a picture of Jesus, but like the pastor didn't like the picture of Jesus, and so he wanted to ace it up the cross. That's very important. But also you wanted to block out the picture of Jesus. You see, you can't see it anymore? I heard that once, and it's why it has the circle in the middle.
And actually, more specifically, ironically for this month that we're in, it was because Jesus is still there, but he's depicted as a white European, which isn't historically accurate. And so that was one of the motivating reasons for doing that, is because that's something that
So it wasn't just an artistic disagreement, and that has a theological implication, right? If you're depicting Jesus with lily white skin, that is not, number one, historically accurate, and it's not theologically accurate either. So yeah, you have that interesting thing, but the cross is central. Richard used to tell a story about there was a church that built a big wooden cross right here, and the pastor would always have to duck around it as they were talking. And that said something, but it might be going a little too far. But we want to keep the cross central. You know, Jesus is at the center of all this. When we worship God, we worship Jesus, and vice versa, right? So we have Trinitarian theology sort of embedded into the structure. Yeah, what about the stained glass? What is stained glass? Or do you have something else?
No,
Yes.
it's one of my favorite things about this building is each of the windows is one of the I ams that Jesus said. So I am the good shepherd, I am the bread of life, I am the Lamb of God, etc., etc.
Right.
So
Right. And there's 8 of those, right? So that fits with the 8 windows, right?
So yeah, that's something I've always loved about this space.
Yeah.
To me, the stained glass and other features, including lamps, the fixtures hanging down, but especially the color, and the windows, we're reminded that God is the creator of all things. And we are creators as well, in the sense that we have artistic expression. We can explore lots of different ways to express ourselves through art. And even in our tradition.
Yeah. Somebody made a choice of how to depict each of the I ams.
Mm-hmm.
Someone built the stained glass and worked with the glass. I really want to learn how to work stained glass one of these days, but I'm terrified of paper cuts. So you don't really want to think about that with glass. But maybe when I retire, I'll get into that. We'll see. But so that was what the builder was trying to convey about God. Now I want to ask you a scientific question. Those are all theology questions, right? Words about God. Okay, what about the light? God made the light. What do you see the light doing? So you can even just have a very simple thing. What do you see the light doing as a verb that you can assign to the light? In that picture, in this room, and if you want to go deeper, once you say the what light is doing, it's a harder question. What does that say about God? So first of all, what do you see light doing in this picture? Filtering through the stained glass, right? It doesn't. What's that? Yeah. So if it gets bent by the glass, technically that's refracting. And we also see reflecting off. So we see refraction, reflection. Light also does some other crazy things. If you look into the physics of light, it also diffracts if it goes through a grid. My postdoctoral research was in X-ray crystallography, which sounds kind of new agey, but it's really science. And what we do is we use diffraction to figure out where all the protein structures, where all the atoms are in protein and things like that. So that's got chemistry in it, and that's your first hint that I am a chemist when it comes to science. And so I learned how to do science, and I use light. We use light in absorbance. So when you put light through a sample and it shines through, it becomes a different color. It can absorb the light. And so light can do 6 different things by science, all of which are pretty unique things. Yeah, other thoughts about what light is doing or what it means that we have a space that is illuminated by light from outside. This is a harder question, but feel free to be a little speculative and sort of guess. What does the fact that God made light tell us about God?
Light means the Bible is good, truth, and holiness.
Right, so we can unpack those words. True, like the nature of the universe at the very deepest level, is light. Light reveals what is true. the very first thing that happened, according to physics, if you roll back the time, the first thing that happened in the universe was light. There was light. Now, light has many forms, including X-rays, like X-ray diffraction that I did, and things like that. And so, but we see only a narrow range of light, in the sense that we only see a narrow range of what God is doing. We only see the wavelengths from 400 to 700 nanometers long. And light can go all the way up to meters long, all the way down to, I'm not sure how far, but pretty far, as far as how compact it can be. But even that has limits. Even light can only be so close together. What else what else can we say about light that tells us something about God?
It's diverse.
Oh, so it's diverse, lots of different wavelengths, lots of different colors that you see here. Oh, provides more. Yeah, more light and heat, right? Yeah, and I can talk about the physical mechanism of that, right? But who made the physical mechanism, and the light is a good thing, just like creation is good. Yeah, so we wanted to think about that. Yeah, another one.
Light provides nourishment by helping plants create food, and we eat plants and get food ourselves.
Right, and the light gives the plants life, and the plants give us life. We don't photosynthesize ourselves, right? We don't, unless we, you can take solar panels, but that's really a stretch. We're not doing ourselves the photosynthetic work. We are dependent on other things that can do chemistry we can't. When we eat a salad, you're actually eating the sunlight that comes in from the system. The other thing is that we don't have enough energy on our own to survive. We have to depend on the sunlight going through the plants and going to us in that direction. And there's so much abundant sunlight that it's way more than we need. The sun is far more generous than we actually need, and we just capture a fraction of that to be able to live. And the sun, even, the other thing I want to bring up is biology is the first thing that people think of. The sun also drives chemistry and geology. It drives weather patterns, as we know from clouds in Seattle and things like that. And even more complex things like wildfires are connected to, everything's all connected. So that's, the light is giving life in some way. And that is very clearly a theological statement. So we go around this, and the one other thing I want to mention, the reason why light diffracts, the weird thing why light diffracts and why light refracts, actually, is related to the fact that light is a wave. The reason why we can model what light does when it comes through a window or something like that, we can also say that the reason why it does certain things is because light's a particle. Well, which one are you? You're either a wave or a particle, except for something like light. When you get down to that small of a thing, you're both. Depending on how you're observed, which is really weird. But if you get down to quantum mechanics, there's some really interesting things to talk about. I'm not talking about that today, I'm talking about chemistry, okay? But when you look at light, light is both and when it comes to wave and particle. That makes the things like we can say God is both the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit at the same time. Coexistent, co-eternal, all this stuff. And how can that happen? We are made of matter and we can't coexist with somebody else. And yet we can, in a sense, coexist with God, who gives us existence. But yet God is also transcendent and far beyond what we can ask or imagine. So, putting all this together shows you that we have a lot to talk about when it comes to theology. I'm going to try to talk about one corner of this. And notice what we did. When we looked at the architecture, we were doing architectural theology. When I looked at light, I'm looking at a piece of nature. And I'm assuming from that, God made this. And God is saying something through this. What does light tell us about who God is? What kind of creator would make a world like this? And people do this, atheists do this, agnostics do this. Everyone does this because they say, even a statement of, I look at the world and I conclude that there is no God. That is also a statement of natural theology. It's negative theology, but it's still natural theology, right? So I want to ask how chemicals work. I'm going to answer that same question. And the theme for today is I want to say what I've found as I've looked into natural history with chemistry is that God's grace is not just abundant, it's superabundant. In the same way that the sun is superabundant, giving us light to see by, and giving it warmth and nourishment and weather and stuff like that. Okay. So, we got to be careful though. I could have asked you, how can we go wrong? And I was actually a little bit nervous because somebody could say, if you ask something about life, you could say something wrong about God. You could be wrong in your natural theology because we can be wrong in our apprehension of nature. God could not be speaking that way. And that chance event that happened to you, maybe it was God speaking to you, but maybe not. Maybe it was another voice. Maybe it was your own selfish nature. And maybe it was something, worse than that. So natural events do not always lend themselves to easy interpretations. And what I was thinking of, where's a natural event that you shouldn't overinterpret? You can't see it anymore, but for a long time there was a patch right up there at the top of the ceiling because lightning struck this while people were apparently doing worship practice. I don't know who exactly was there, but there was actually lightning struck this building one day. And of course, the Cairo News even got the New York Daily News that our little church was hit by a thunderbolt during a worship practice. They usually didn't get that right. Actually, journalists don't always get things right. I say that because I go through a school of journalism myself, so I try. But the thing is, if we interpreted that the worship band had done something wrong, and therefore God was going to smite them, and so we shouldn't play that song anymore. I think it was literally they were practicing the song "Let Your Fire Come Down." I heard that. Is that
Remember, it was Lucas Culver though, and
okay.
it was a really bad time.
Yeah. So you don't want to overinterpret that. I don't think that God doesn't like that song. So we've got to be careful when we're looking at this. Nature only takes us so far. We are still in need of revelation, and we still are in need to look to Jesus, who is the perfection of theology, the fullness of God, and one of the reasons why when we look at Jesus, we can see God. So what does it mean, though, that Jesus was there at creation, that in Jesus all things were made, as we prayed at the beginning? So we want to unpack all those things, and that's what I want to do today. Okay, so I do want to connect it to last week, because I think Rod last week, I think there's a couple people who were here last week. Rod talked about church history, and he talked about the Edict of Constantine, where Constantine, for the newly statified church, I'm not sure what the right word is, but Christianity was made legal, and not just legal, but the official church of the empire. And Constantine set when Easter was going to be, and in doing so, he made a lot of, his reasoning was, Jewish people killed Jesus, therefore we should move Easter away from Passover because they killed Jesus. I don't want to unpack how many things are wrong with that reasoning right there. But and then the other thing is that he made the edict, and he put the power of the empire, the power of the sword, behind that choice. So there wasn't much debate after that. So a choice made for bad reasons, implemented by coercion, and that's why Easter was calculated after the first new moon. If they wanted to do that, they always wanted it to be on a Sunday. So the thing is, the Roman Church, the church was headquartered in Rome, and they expanded, and they got up to England, but there was also this thing called the fall of the Roman Empire that happened at that point. And there was a lot of ways in which knowledge was lost, and the knowledge of the church was lost. The way that the knowledge was preserved was way over on the northwest corner of Europe. You had St. Patrick there, and St. Patrick established a branch of the church, Celtic Christianity, and you can see that there's all these things that you can see it if you can zoom in a little bit, but I can tell you it's around the year 400, year 500. After the year 500, the church started to expand. They had preserved the knowledge, some of the knowledge that was lost in Europe. And they were sending missionaries out, and I just have to point out, 635, I don't know if you can read that, the missionary is named Aidan. And that, in my opinion, is a way to spell Aidan. People can spell it any way they want, but we named one of our sons Aidan, partially after this guy who went out to Lindisfarne to be able to spread the gospel, to tell people about Jesus and to follow his teachings. So meanwhile, at the same time, the Roman church was still down here, and the Roman church was expanding north. So you have the Celtic church sort of expanding south, the Roman church expanding north, and they met in the middle. And then there was a lot of, everyone was happy and went home and lived happily ever after, right? there was conflict. You had different cultures and different churches. They were working from the same scripture, and they did recognize that they all worshiped Jesus. So they tried to meet on that. So the same debate happened again. We talked about the debate about the date of Easter. The Roman Church had the system going back to Constantine. But of course, the Celtic Church was separated, and they actually celebrated it. They celebrated Easter on March 25. Think about that date. Why would somebody celebrate Easter on March 25? What is special about that date?
Equinox.
So it's very close to the equinox. The equinox technically changes a little bit, right? But it's very close to it, so it has that resonance. But it's not March 21 or 22, it's March 25, which is a little bit off. What about a date that we all know as one of the major, probably the major festival of most people that has Christian meaning? December 25. What's true about March 25?
Oh, 9 months.
3 months later, or 9 months earlier, right? What would have happened 9 months before December 25? Gabriel appears to Mary. And so, they also had a tradition that they figured Easter was on March 25 because, and this is extra biblical, but they said a prophet can only be killed on their birthday or on their day of conception.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so that gave them two options, and clearly Easter was not, they already had Christmas, you know, and also Easter was in the spring,
Those
right?
different dates.
What's that?
Those different dates. The date of your conception versus.
Yeah, so 9 months before the date of your birth.
Conception as in.
Yeah. Conception as in, the you shall bear a son and things like that. Yeah. It's interesting how this is related to science because how long does a baby take to gestate? You know, things like that. Biology, right? So you have the issue. They chose that date because they said Jesus was killed on the date of his Annunciation. But the Roman Christians wanted to always celebrate on Sunday. The thing about March 25th is that you would have Easter like on Thursday. And the holiest day of the year, it definitely happened on Sunday the first time, you know, so you kind of want to keep that going. So they resolved the dispute by having a conference. Yeah.
So they considered that he was crucified on the
Right.
25th, not resurrected.
That's possible. That's possible too. And I'm not sure that they were that precise. Yeah, but they would have said that actually it should have been March 28th, but nobody pointed that out to them. The other thing is that actually you can see this in people who know about Celtic Christianity. Anybody know what date March 25 is in Tolkien? It becomes the first day of the year after King Aragorn, spoiler, establishes it, because it is the day that the tower fell, the Dark Tower. March 25th, and he deliberately puts it in there. And he has them say that. You know, Tolkien is very careful to keep Jesus out of Middle Earth. Of course, he had theological reasons for that. He wanted to be kind of like Lewis, but different. In that it was sort of an alternate, what would God do if he created something? But Tolkien was very insistent that some aspects get into it, such as the fellowship leaves Rivendell on December 25. And the basically evil is defeated on March 25th. It becomes the New Year's Day for the rest of the kingdom of Aragorn that's set up. Okay, anyways, that didn't get into the movie. But it's a moment where he wakes up and he's sort of resurrected and everyone's dressed in white. And Tolkien deliberately did that. It's one of the ways in which the movie is true to Tolkien. Anyways, but they had the thing is that link actually goes pretty deep. But they had a debate, and they had a debate right there at Whitby Abbey, okay? Also at Whitby Abbey, you had it run by, she's now sainted, so she is now Saint Hilda, or Saint Hild. And she created the space. We don't have writings of hers, but we have the result of the reconciliation where, again, spoiler alert, they chose to go with the Roman way so we could have it on Sunday. Also, the king wanted to go the Roman way, so we have a little echo of the Constantinianism going on there. But whatever it wasn't as ugly as Constantine's original edict. It didn't have any of that. It was really a space for people to work out their differences. And she housed them all, and she arranged for them all to have what they needed. Anybody who's ever had a big party or maybe put together a wedding or something like that will know that there's a lot of work to do just to have people in the same space. She also made space for scholars on a wider basis, and it turns out that Caedmon was encouraged by her. Caedmon was a shepherd. Does anyone know what Caedmon did? Why we know Caedmon now? This is on Caedmon's cross, by the way, which is at Whitby Abbey. Any ideas? Caedmon wrote the first song in the English language, and it's a hymn of praise to God. And so, and he was encouraged to do that by being part of this community. So did Caedmon do it? Or did Hilda do it by creating the space for it? The other thing I want to point out is that when you see Hilda on Caedmon's cross, you see those weird little squirrels. And those aren't, actually, if you look at them closely, they have heads. And if you look at them on stained glass, you can see that Hilda's crest is 3 of these, and they're little spiral shells called ammonites. Now, I don't have an ammonite in the mini museum that's going around. By the way, do we have a mini museum somewhere? Is the mini museum down to this table? Yeah, can you all pass to this table? So just feel free to look around at this. These are little artifacts, and I'm going to show them after our discussion. But those are particular fossils called ammonites. But there's nothing quite like them, and yet in the stone, they're all over the place. So here's a picture that shows looking across. This is looking east. And you see there's a river-esque down here. And you can see there's a big, deep cliff. And they would find the ammonites all down at this cliff, so they were literally underneath Hilda's feet. There's Whitby Abbey. And by the way, it's also Bram Stoker got his inspiration for Dracula from the ruins of Whitby Abbey. That's another story. Okay. But why is there such a big cliff there? There's a big cliff there because there's a break in the rocks underneath. If you look at the river Esk, here's the river going, and if you look at the river Esk, there is a Whitby fault, which runs almost straight north and south, where the earth has cracked, and the river runs down that crack. So if we zoom in on that, and then we see Whitby Abbey is located right there. So you see how the river is sort of meandering down, it's going sort of northeast, then all of a sudden it turns straight north. The reason is because there's a fault underneath. The fault created a crack in the earth, rediverted the river, and then the river was running into a wall, and it was eroding lots of stuff, and it revealed ammonites underneath. And that's why they have so many ammonites that are underneath that area. These are what ammonites look like. They're bigger than what will fit in that. Here's a big one that you have outside the Red Path Museum in Montreal, which is a really great place to visit if you want to go to a big museum, not the mini museum. And but you can actually sit on it. I think you're allowed to sit on it because I'm sure people have. It looks like a bench. But people were wondering about how did all these ammonites get here, and why don't we have any ammonites that we can see today? They had an explanation, but the explanation was wrong. They said that Hilda petrified all the snakes, an echo of snake peppers, and sent them to the ground, and they had proof going around. Some people would carve heads. This is not really on the ammonite, okay? This is fake. But they would carve it, they would say, here's the proof that Hilda petrified the snakes and put them underneath. When the truth, in my view, is a lot more interesting. The reason why they found out that these were actually not put there by Hilda, but were much older than any human that stepped foot on those cliffs, was because we had an explosion of science in England in the 18th and 19th centuries. And why did it happen there and not somewhere else? Well, it was because the church was kind of, in a sense, the church was a little decadent at the time. But out of the decadence came something very good. It came modern science. One of the things that you'll notice in the 1890s, if you've read like Jane Austen, you know the Mr. Collins, right? Is he a vicar or a rector or what?
Yeah.
A vicar? I don't know the difference between vicar or rector or priest. But they had, the thing is, in England, the church had its power, and as part of the unintentional consequences of them getting rich off other areas of the country, of the world, that they, the church had time. And some of them weren't very good theologians, and they ended up doing hobbies. But as hobbies, they ended up doing things that ended up being useful. So like their playtime ended up forming the basis for much of regular science. So the most famous one is probably Reverend William Buckland, who wrote the first full account of a dinosaur. And so you have the dinosaur bones in the mini museum that are going around. There's a vicar, Edmund Cartwright, who invented the power loom. And tens of thousands of power looms were used in the Industrial Revolution, with the pluses and minuses that the Industrial Revolution brought, right? Reverend Jack Russell bred the Jack Russell Terrier, probably not as impactful, but probably something that we know better than power looms or even dinosaurs. So they had time on their hands, but some of the time resulted in finding out something true about the nature that we were able to later build on. The first geologist, this built a culture of experimentation, and James Hutton was not part of the church, but he was part of this culture. He was an MD and a farmer, and being a farmer, he had too much time, or he was actually looking at the rocks to try to figure out how to farm better. And he ended up finding these weird structures in it. And he found one called Hutton's Unconformity. This is what it looks like. If you look at this, you see that there is rock going like this, and there's rock that's tilted and going like this, and there's a clear line, an unconformity between the two types of rock. He was curious about this, and he basically cataloged this and many other things. People came out to see it. Eventually, they developed a theory for how the rocks move that made sense to the laws of chemistry. The one thing is it required a lot of time. And so they started to look at this and they started to say, if all we need is a lot of time to explain this, maybe we can explain it. So others followed Hutton. Other geologists looked for other conformities. And there's a really curious pattern that they found. And this is seen in the Grand Canyon, but also in many places around the world. There is a huge conformity. The biggest conformity you can find is universal across the globe. It's called the Great Unconformity, where they find it. Here it is in the Grand Canyon, and you can see, you can date the rocks underneath it, you can date the rocks above it, and get an idea of the limits of when it happened. The rocks underneath it are always the same age. The Great Unconformity, here it is in Colorado. And so what they do is they concluded that the mechanism for this was, and there's other evidence for this as well, that the entire Earth was covered with frozen water. Glaciers carved the Great Unconformity. They scoured the Earth, and then eventually they melted when the weather cycles, the climate cycles changed again. And that resulted in all this rock being dissolved in the oceans. And so the sandstone above, the other thing is the sandstone right above it, see right there is Cambrian marine sandstone. Is some of the oldest, it is the oldest at the time that they could find evidence of life in. So you have the Great Unconformity, a geological event, and I have a little arrow for that. Glaciers that happened right before, and right after, all of a sudden you see all these weird rocks, all these weird, and at first they thought it was just like an accident or something like that. But the more they looked, they found out these were actually once living creatures that had somehow been petrified. It's the same thing as the Ammonites. So you can do this, and this is where I want to tell you a little bit about a family day hike. I don't know if anybody has been to Banff National Park and done a hike there. If you've done this exact hike, that's great. And this is the one hike that you can do where you can find Cambrian fossils for yourself. All the other ones are guided and secretly, but this one was already there, and then they found the fossils, and so they can close it down. And so I'm going to tell you about it, but just promise to use it responsibly, okay? Here it is. It's technically, I believe it's across, it is in BC, so it's just north of us, a little bit to the east. And if you look at that, and I just want to show you, you see this valley right here. See how it's been scooped out? There's all sorts of evidence that it was scooped out by a glacier. That's what glaciers do. They make these U-shaped valleys that are way up in the mountains. Okay, so you can hike up into the valley, and most people, the trail is there to see the glacier. So you hike up at first, and there was a fire there before. I don't know, let's see, Lori and I are in these pictures, but we look the same age as we did then. Our kids look very different, but we don't change, right? Anyways, I'll tell myself that. That is Aiden right there. And there's Benjamin. He was a little bit littler there. So if you know my kids, there they are. And there you see the hanging valley in front of you, big U-shaped thing. If you ever see that out hiking, you can know that that was made by a glacier. So the thing that I'm going to tell you, though, is we never got all the way to the glacier. You see a waterfall on your right, and you turn and go toward it. That's what it looks like. So this is kind of like a quest from a fantasy novel, from Lord of the Rings. You see the waterfall, and you turn off, and you scramble over. And then you find treasure by flipping over rocks. You see all those rocks right there. You can just flip them over and sometimes find some. They're also sandstones, so they're little layers. And you can just throw them on the ground. I think the geologists are a little more gentle, but you can throw them on the ground and split apart, and then you can see fossils. And we found fossils just turning over rocks there. That's how many there were. This is, so you can discover weird fossils, and I have this in my book. And so I work with 2 artist scientists on the book. Gayla Bent drew what these look like. And this is not an artist's imagination. If you look at this right here, you can see that's actually pretty accurate. That's what it looked like. It's a weird creature, and they're trying to figure out, where did that come from? Those are all through the Cambrian rocks. Here's another one that we found. And you can see this. You can even see the little feet. And some of them are even weirder. So I wanted to ask, why do we do this? You know, we were asking that question on the way up a little bit. The kids were a little whiny. And we said, you're going to find fossils, but I was also like, are we really going to find fossils? And you didn't think they would just, are there enough to find? I was like having a crisis, you know, and I'm like, they're all going to eat this and they'll never want to hide again. But of course, we got to emphasize, we did not get any fossils because we were good. And they have a little box there, by the way. If you find fossils, you leave them in the box. So you're healthy, right? By smashing rocks and finding fossils. We didn't take that trip to acquire things. Instead, what we did is we tried to make space for the kids, and we wanted to shape our imaginations. And this is an idea that the natural world was created, spoken into being by God. And God shaped it. We can shape our imaginations by looking at it. Again, to a certain extent only. Only gets us so far. But there are some things, and this is what Paul was talking about in Romans 1, where he says you can know God from the things that are made. Some aspects of God, his eternal power and his godliness. It's like the word is like the godliness of God or something like that in Greek. They translate it as something a little less weird or redundant. But divine nature is how it's translated. So divine nature. And what does that even mean? I struggle with what that means. But it does mean that there is something you can tell about the Creator by looking at his creation. And here's another quote about it. An imagination that is formed by natural things like seeds sown and growing into plants, lilies and sparrows flying or falling, that's the bridge to the whole universe. It is this natural world which provides the sacraments and which points to Jesus, because the sacraments point to Jesus, right? What does this mean? And hopefully, as I'm reading that, maybe you're thinking of some of the things that Jesus said that this author is alluding to. Because now I've talked enough, and I want you to be able to talk. All right, so I want you to think about 2 discussion questions so you can pick which one you want. And I'm going to hand out something to each table. Each table has pencils on it. And I'd like each table to elect a stenographer, to be able to write down what these are. And I have the questions that I'd like you all to choose and discuss and write down what your answers are, just some notes about what your different answers are, so that I can keep them for my own purposes and I can see what you wrote and talk about. So the thing that we want to talk about is how nature is sort of superabundant. And I guess Romans 5 says that where grace abounded, where sin abounded, grace abounded even more. Grace was superabundant. There's a lot of that language that comes through. So the first question is just, what is the place where you found something surprising and superabundant, more than you expected in nature? Just like we found the fossils that were more than we expected to be there. And the second question, when does Jesus use natural metaphors? We had a couple alluded to on the last slide. And how are those, like what Paul's saying here, how are those saying that what God gives through nature is much more than we asked or imagined? It exceeds our expectations. So you can choose the nature question or the theology question, but go ahead and take about 10, 15 minutes to go around the table, and I'd like everyone to answer one of those questions, and please do write it down for me, okay? And I'll be sort of hanging around if you want to have questions. So yeah. Each table say someone who's going to write, and then answer whichever questions you want. But there's enough. All right, take a couple more minutes to finish up. If you haven't had a chance to introduce yourself, you can always introduce yourself to the other people at the table as well. And we'll get back together in just a minute. But the other thing is that we were talking with some groups. I very specifically did not use the word good here. Even the word grace is good, but it doesn't always seem that way. And nature is made good, but not everything that happens in nature is good. And so when I think about surprising and superabundant, I deliberately did not use the word good because I wanted you to think about, well, sometimes there's superabundant natural evil. And what do we do with that when the tsunami takes out an entire beach? When we had these things about warnings, earthquakes. The big thing was Portugal, I think it was Lisbon, but experienced a huge earthquake on Easter Sunday during services. The biggest earthquake they've had in thousands of years, and lots of people were killed by churches collapsing on them. That is not good, right? And yet it is nature. And so we have to struggle with that if we're going to talk about natural theology. But the thing I also wanted to think about is that Jesus does use natural metaphors, and many times he's talking about the goodness of God, but sometimes he's talking about the terrible goodness of God. It's terribly good, right? And if you take that word apart, terrible does come from the feeling of the fear of God and the idea, how do we wrestle with that? And yet the fullness of God was revealed in Jesus. And I don't think anybody, we know that Jesus was good. So my one thing about these are very complicated questions, very hard questions. But they are answered not by propositions, but by looking to Jesus. It's one of the reasons why we have the cross right there. And the cross was good, Good Friday, right? But that word is hard for us to understand. And so I want you to, when you get, this is why I love theology actually, because it seems like in some cases it's simple on the surface. And you find out it says deep as your own mind. It says deep as your own soul, and deeper, because it describes God who is deeper than us all. Okay. So I want to, that's the one risk about talking about natural theology. You always are leaving something out, and you're usually talking about the good aspects of creation, because they're the ones that you want to focus on as scientists, right? How did things happen? How can I understand this? But there are a lot of things we just don't understand. I want to focus rather on the good thing that there is anything that we can understand at all, which you have quotes from all sorts of scientists with all sorts of theological beliefs that sit in wonder that we can understand anything at all. And I want to say that there's also fields that we separate into fields. We have to do this because I can't teach everything. I just choose to teach chemistry. And yes, I did actually choose to teach that. Chemistry is the best. Talk to me if you want to watch. Okay? But one of the reasons why chemistry is the best is because it's something I'm going to tell you about in just a second. I think it's so great, I wrote a book about it. But it started with this idea of these ammonites. Where did they come from? Okay? They showed that a biological thing could turn into a geological thing, not because it was cursed by a saint, but because of a chemical process, which I think is cool too. Okay? So if that can happen, could a geological thing turn into a biological thing? Actually, they used to say this could happen all the time. Spontaneous generation is where flies came from, And it took science to be able to say, well, no, that doesn't work that way. But I still think there are ways that geology can influence biology, and we shouldn't put a wall between them. I am a biochemist. I have to combine biology and chemistry. It's in my job description. Okay? And so that's why I like breaking down these walls. Could a chemical thing turn into a biological thing? So these are different areas that we try to separate. They were made, this actually has a theological basis, because it says that all science was made by God and was made good. And that these things do influence each other, that we section out into different disciplines because of our human limited nature of our knowledge. In the same way that biology, chemistry, and geology are related, I want to say science and theology are also related. And, it's even hard to come up with a term for it. I actually don't like the term science and faith, but it's what people understand, and so I'll use it. Because I think that faith is bigger than antonym to science. I think faith, and also we think about faith wrong. Anyways, we make faith too limited. We make it believing in propositions rather than an event of trusting in God. And but that comes from a theologian, Karl Barth. But that's another story. Okay, so they can speak. I got to focus on the chemistry. They can speak to each other if we make space to receive them as gifts coming from God, in the same way that Hilda made space, in the same way that actually, inadvertently, the church made space for science to develop by having all these bad preachers with too small congregations, So I do want to say that I don't think this is stepping on St. Patrick's toes. I want to take his prayer and I want to say, well, how can I use the same prayer with new words? Christ above me, I think of astronomy. And I think of the paths of the planets being so regular, the fact that Jupiter and the moon are there. Without those, we would probably not have life at all. They protect us in certain ways. We have invisible shields. Christ beneath me, geology, the fossils that Hilda probably found herself when she was walking on the beach one day. The layers of rock that tell a story, and there's also a protection underneath us. The fact that we have a molten core means we have a magnetic field that protects us from the ravages of the sun. And that's where the aurora comes from, by the way. So the aurora is deflected bad energy that would break us apart if it got to us. But instead it changed into beautiful light, the best color, green. You don't have to agree with me on that, but I do think green is my favorite color. Okay. Christ beside me, biology, the connection of animals to plants that we talked about with photosynthesis, and all these connections, and to the environment itself. And as biochemistry, I think that there's chemistry underneath all of these. The main thing about this is when you look up into the sky especially, but also when we look at the rocks and when we look at genes, we can see that there are rules that we can understand. And it looks like these rules were followed by the God as the lawgiver who gives the rules, who makes the rules, and creation followed God's rules. And now we can go look at it and we can take those apart and we can figure out the rules that held creation in place. Okay? How tightly was it held in place? And how quickly did it jump from one thing to another? I want to put those forward as secondary questions. The primary question is, did God make it, and did God make it good? And then we can talk about mechanisms and how. But I see faithfulness and consistency when I look at the consistency of the rules through deep time. So, I wrote a book about how chemistry underlies all these different things. And some of the early chapters actually have to do with astronomy more. But now but I want to talk about chapter 9, because the reason why I wanted to hike up to the waterfall to get the fossils was because I wrote chapter 9 about the Cambrian fossils. I got all these pictures, I gave them to Gayla, she sketched them out, and I wanted them to be interspersed into the text, but you don't have that much control of your text when you're working with a publishing house, and they simply ignored what I asked them to do. And I even tried to move it, and then they ignored it again. So that's just a lesson of being an author. But we can ask what these fossils mean. What does it mean that there's an extinct race of Ammonites that are not people from the Empire of Ammon that they were named after, but they were actually species that we never got to see or examine or hold. The creativity of the Cambrian explosion, those weird animals, is more than I expected. So this is where I see superabundance. The age is more than I expected. My proposal is that the Cambrian explosion happened at that time for a reason. And the reason is not a saint cursing the snakes, but the reason is something that we can still figure out, and we can still, a rule that we can figure out today. A reason that is chemical in nature because it involves atoms coming together in chemical bonds. And therefore, if it happened for a reason that we can figure out, we can say that it was in some sense predictable. Okay? That level of that movement in life was predictable. If this is so, the world is intelligible and has a deep structure in addition to having a deep freedom. Obviously life has freedom, right? But what are the limits to that freedom? That God set the bound for the sea. Here you shall go, and there no further. And it doesn't make sense to quibble about if the ocean line recedes by like 5 feet. That's still true, right? It's that kind of thing. That's why I'm dividing the essentials from non-essentials. I believe that these things, the intelligibility and the deep structure of the world, are essentials. How you interpret them may be non-essential. So I think of the elements as seeds of reason. I use this phrase because it was used all the way back by Augustine. He actually took it from the Stoic philosophers, but Augustine is, in many ways, the first modern human who really looked at himself the way we look at ourselves. And so St. Augustine used this to describe how God created. God planted seeds, and they came to fruition. And so Augustine obviously had no idea. He thought there were 4 elements, right? Maybe 5 if you count quintessence. We now know that there are 100, but there's only 100. And so is it really that different? Is 100 closer to 4 or closer to infinity? No, 100 is still a limited number. And so the seed metaphor was used throughout the late medieval, early modern period. And actually there was a time when people were saying, should we talk about laws of nature? Or should we talk about seeds of reason? And I want to recover that. I don't want to say laws of nature are bad. Like I just talked about how the consistency of the laws is really cool. But laws really apply best to physics. Maybe the metaphor of seeds applies well to things that grow like biology and biochemistry. So that's why I want to recover this old metaphor. Maybe even Hilda used the seeds of reason metaphor. And now I can restate her theology in different words. In particular, I want to talk about the key role of oxygen. And if you all know, Richard actually wrote a book titled O2. It doesn't have the subscript right, I don't think, but everything else is great. So there's a book about how he used breathing as a metaphor, how we need oxygen from outside ourselves. All completely true. What I do is I take that and I look back in natural history, and I think of oxygen as possibly a trigger for the Cambrian explosion. And there's only so many elements, by the way. So if this story ends up being right and supported, then it's true wherever the periodic table exists, wherever chemistry works like this. The periodic table is universal. You don't have a different periodic table on Jupiter. And Alpha Centauri, same periodic table. Why we can look so much? So that does imply there's an element of predictability in the sense of if we have life that depends on water on another planet, maybe it could have happened that way again. And C.S. Lewis's space trilogy could actually kind of happen. Okay. So I just want to run quickly through the chemistry of this. I just have to show a little bit of chemistry. Oxygen is key because life affects the planet. The planet affects life, and life affects the planet. One of the things is that early life actually ejects oxygen before plants, or actually photosynthetic microbes can actually make oxygen. It's what plants do. And it's what we depend on. So maybe it's what everything depends on, right? That you harness this essentially endless energy from the sun. So all the chemical rules that bring these things inside and push those things outside, I go on and on about it in my book. But I'll just say that actually cells produce oxygen, and that starts to fill up in the atmosphere, and then animals can use that oxygen. And it's kind of a cool story how those all go together. And in fact, it looks like there were two big jumps up in oxygen in history. And so there were two oxygenation events. First one after plants or microbes figured out photosynthesis. The second one, well, what caused it? Because the second oxygenation event coincides, at least the end of it, coincides with the Great Unconformity. And so put this all together, geology, chemistry, and biology, the fossils. And so it's the idea of oxygen as a seed that was being slowly released over time, but then you have these jumps. And after you have the oxygen jumps, you have jumps in species. Chemistry first, I'm biased. Biology follows. Okay? And there's chemical reasons for this. Oxygen does the chemistry that you need, and it makes the structures, and we can look and try to figure out when structures were formed. And it looks like oxygen is there, calcium is there, and phosphorus is there. By the way, what are the 6 biggest elements? These are 3, I don't want to ask because the answer is 6 parts. But calcium, phosphorus, and oxygen are majorly in rocks. If you have a glaciation event that covers the whole planet, that scrapes rocks into the ocean, you have more calcium, more phosphorus, and that promotes more life, which makes more oxygen. So all 3 of these can be tied to the Great Unconformity. And that can be dated to exactly to the explosion. So I wasn't going to get away without putting up something that Mary made. So Mary back there is one of the 2 that worked with us too. Yeah, exactly. So here's the credit. This is the graph that Mary made, and I always ask for a lot of things to be thrown on my graphs, but I want you to look at this in particular. Look at these lines. Oh, I covered this up for a reason. Oh, and I just turned it off. Okay. This is where the Burgess Shale right here is where we were finding fossils. And you can see it's a little line. You have number of species. It's the black line here. And it jumped up a little after 600 million years ago. Right before that, you have the gray line. The gray line is the oxygen percentage in the atmosphere. Gray line coming from the glaciations. Rodinia, by the way, is the big supercontinent they have then. When it broke up, it created a bunch of shoreline, and the idea is that that could have led to more oxygen being there too. And that was related to glaciers. Anyways, it's all complex, like you can expect. It's a whole planet, you know? We can't really sum it up that easily. But the thing is, you look at the gray line and the black line, and they both go up and down at about the same time. And if anything, the gray line precedes the black line, except here the gray line gets a little bit out of hand. It looks like the oxygen overshot. And we end up with a lot of coal in these parts. It's called the Carboniferous, because we get carbon rocks from all the life being done. But it looks like life overshot. And it looks like then you had a massive extinction event, the Permian Tertiary extinction event. Did that happen because we had too much oxygen? But then we slowly dealt with it, and we built it up again. And it's not going up anymore. It's raised. We don't have to worry about the Carboniferous era happening again. It also had like the 10-foot dragonflies that you were thinking. Gigantism is possibly related to oxygen concentration. So it's probably good if you don't like 10-foot dragonflies. It's probably good that we don't have 30% oxygen. Not to mention the atmospheric nights, way too easily. If you think wildfires are bad now. So it looks like we've now stabilized at about 20% oxygen. But it used to be 2%. And it looks like it moved in step with life. To me, this is correlation. This is saying that the murderer had motive, right, and had access to the time. But maybe there's an alibi that comes up or things like that. Where, we aren't completely sure about this yet because it's such a big question. But I must say, since the book came out, it's come even more in focus. There are parts of the book that I've had to sort of say, oh, well, the science on that was bad. But it's literally like 5% of the book at most. And 95% of it has only been increasing. And so this is why I was passing around the mini museum right there. It had little examples of the Jurassic tree that was formed by being able to form oxygen bonds. And you have, of course, dinosaurs. There's a little ankylosaurus bone that is in here. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it, I welcome you to come up and check it out later. So the thing is, oxygen was a seed, and this is actually, I think this is the last thing I have. Yes. I want to look at oxygen as a seed of reason, and that there are chemical laws, natural laws that are given by a lawgiver. And so this is sort of everything that I said put together. The seed of oxygen bore fruit, and I want to say that I've been talking about maybe individual humans, but eventually when you have enough humans, you have a society. And you have society, you have community. And that community can be brought together by the work of the Spirit. And we talk about Acts 2 today. And that's the same kind of thing, that you have to have a intelligent people community. Humans are intelligent. And we can, when we don't get in our own way, and when we're given the grace that we need. It's not just a matter of getting out of our own way. We still can't do it right. But God, just like God gives light from the sun, God gives grace for the community to come together. And gives grace for us to be able to share with each other and live by the Spirit. And that is Trinitarian theology, because that is the work of the Spirit, the Father and the Spirit, and the Son and the Spirit as well. So I just want to say that this is like, maybe some people thought of this when you're talking about the seed. It's one of Jesus' first parables in Mark, where he talks about the sower scattering the seed on the ground. And a lot of different things happen. But some good things happen when it falls on good soil. This is a biogeochemical metaphor. It's talking about soil, it's talking about plants. And, Jesus didn't tell them about oxygen. They probably would scratch their heads and say, what are you talking about? But we know that oxygen binds them together. I just want to think that there is a time. God is at work. The harvest is coming, and God is giving enough, more than enough. This is a sower who gives superabundant. And a lot of good and bad things happen. But there is a harvest that is the intention that God has given us. And He's given us a world that we can take part and we can participate in. But we need to approach it humbly. We need to make space for God as God has made space for us. We need to welcome others as Christ has welcomed us. And we need to live in His light and the gifts that He gives, and trust that we don't live in a world where there's scarcity that causes us to have to compete with each other and fight with each other. We live in a world where we can accept God's light and seek how we can give as well as in giving we receive. So, in honor of St. Francis, that's the end of it. I'd like to just say a quick prayer as we close. God, thank you that you've made this world the light coming in through the windows, that we can even feel the warmth, and help us to see where this leads us to look to you. Help us to see where the world is not enough, and we wait for your Spirit and your revelation. Help us to know when to wait and when to move. I pray that we would make room for the gifts that only you can give and the life that you are bringing us to. Thank you that you are bringing us in this direction. Amen.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Here's the mini museum if any of you